Ever since the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, passenger liners as well as other types of ships had been rapidly evolving. For hundreds of years, ships had remained relatively the same, but within 100 years they went from small sailing ships to small steamships to then a sudden blow-up in size and technology in the 1850s as more and more demand for transport to the New World grew. They again went from small and claustrophobic auxiliary steamships, which used both sails and steam, to enormous palaces, which made you forget you were even on a ship in the first place. By the turn of the century, passenger liners looked completely alien to something that could be seen just 100 years ago. And with this textbook goal of size, speed, and most importantly comfort established, shipping companies like White Star Line, Cunard, Hamburg America, and many others would continue to innovate on this goal. Because of this, these shipping companies continuously battled over control of the market, with each new class of ships just slightly better than the last. In August of 1907, though, the first ship in Cunard's Lusitania class would be completed. This project went through 3 years of designs and more than 2 years of construction before completion, so when the ship finally made her maiden voyage in September of the same year, the ship blew the competition out of the park. She was hundreds of feet longer than past ships, far more luxurious and safe, and had many innovations which would be used for decades to come. Months before Lusitania had even made her maiden voyage, though, White Star Line had already been planning out their versions of the Lusitania class. In mid-1907, Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line, and Lord Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipyards, met in dinner in Lord Peary's home in London. Here, they discussed the newfound economic threat and drew out basic plans for their ideal liner that could compete. Lord Peary envisioned 2 ships, which would focus on size and luxury primarily, sidelining speed. He sketched a ship with 3 towering funnels, 1 main superstructure with several smaller island superstructures aft, 4 masts, 2 whale decks, and a very similar fantail design which could be seen on the Lusitania class. His envisionment showcased a very radical and complex design, which while worked on a smaller White Star liners, I don't think simply scaling up the Big 4 design would have been a good decision. Anyway, Harland and Wolff designers were put to work, the project being led by naval architect Thomas Andrew, his deputy Edward Willing, and the shipyard's general manager Alexander C. The design went through many variants, until eventually Design D was selected and presented to Bruce Ismay on July 29, 1908. The design turned out to be a success, although many changes would inevitably be made before the final design was approved. The keel of what would become Olympic was laid down on December 16, 1908, although at the time she was only known as Number 400. 2 large gantries were constructed in Harland and Wolff shipyards for the ships, the latter only being known as Number 401, laid down 3 months later. During construction, many of the now prevalent design choices would be decided on, such as the engines, that being 2 triple expansion reciprocating steam engines driving 2 outboard 3-blade propellers, as well as 1 central turbine engine driving a single 4-blade propeller. The number of lifeboats, as well as the design of the davits, would also be decided somewhere around this time, with Olympic holding 14 regulation boats about 30 feet long, 2 emergency cutters about 25 feet long, and 4 collapsibles about 27 feet long. The 14 regulation boats could hold about 65 people each, while the 2 cutters were always kept swung out in case of a man going overboard. They could hold about 40 people. While there were sufficiently less boats than what was needed for a ship Olympic size, White Star Line were technically following the regulations set by the Board of Trade. The only problem was, these regulations had been set a decade ago, and the ships had drastically increased in size since then. Nevertheless, Olympic would be fully framed by November of 1909 and fully plated by the summer of 1910. The ship would then be painted a whitish gray color, the only purpose being for better looking photographs for the ship's publicity. RMS Olympic would finally be launched on October 20th, 1910. It took roughly a minute for the ship to reach the water, and afterwards took about 40 seconds to come to a complete stop. Watched by tens of thousands of onlookers, Olympic would then be docked aline a 233-foot high floating crane built years before. Here, she would be fitted with her boilers, fixtures and furnishings, the wiring and piping, as well as her 4 funnels. This process would last until April 1st of 1911, when she was moved to the Thompson dry dock, which had also been built specifically for the Olympic class. While in dry dock, the ship would have her 2 enormous 23-foot wide 3-blade alpha propellers, as well as her single 16-foot wide 4-blade central propeller fitted on. 2 days before the ship's sea trials on May 27th, Olympic would be open to the public until the 29th when she departed. During the voyage, the ship's maneuverability, compass, Marconi set, and many other general tests would take place. After completing and passing these tests, Olympic was handed over to the White Star Line and would sail to Liverpool, her registered port, on the 31st of May 1911, the same day as her sister Titanic would be launched. Olympic arrived in Liverpool a day later on the 1st of June, spending the day yet again open to the public. By midnight, she again departed en route to Southampton, England, where she would make her maiden voyage. Upon arriving on the 3rd of June, she docked in the brand new White Star dock, where the crew would spend 11 days loading cargo and familiarizing themselves with the 882-foot-long ship. On June 14, 1911, first, second, and third class passengers began boarding Olympic until eventually, filled to half her capacity, she backed out from the White Star dock and departed Southampton. The ship was commanded by Captain Edward Smith, one of the most experienced captains of the White Star Line. The ship would also host J. Bruce Ismay, Thomas Andrew, and several more White Star Line and Harland Wolff executives, spending the voyage finding issues and areas of improvement to implement on Titanic. First class on Olympic enjoyed some of the most modern and luxurious offerings on a White Star Liner. 2 grand staircases, the forward of which went from the boat deck all the way down to the E-deck. It had 3 elevators, which went from the A-deck down to the E-deck. Each elevator could house a maximum of 12 people. The grand staircase also housed a reception room on D-deck, a purser's office on C-deck, and generally acted as a gateway to the ship's other public and private spaces. The aft grand staircase was mostly the same, although was less luxurious, and only went down 2 decks. First class housed 2 dining saloons, the main dining saloon on D-deck, as well as a more luxurious but also more costly a la carte restaurant on B-deck. First class also housed a Gregorian-style smoking room, a veranda cafe decorated with palm trees, a reading and writing room, a lounge, all on A-deck, a barber shop on C-deck, Turkish bathrooms, a squash court, and a swimming pool on F-deck, and a gymnasium on the boat deck. For promenade space, first class enjoyed much of the boat deck, as well as all of the A-deck promenade and most of the B-deck promenade. Cabins were spacious and comfortable, some of which even having private bathrooms. Second class on Olympic was a mixture of first and third class, at least in terms of interior. Its staircase was one of a spiral staircase, which housed an elevator in the center. It, just like first class grand staircase, went from the boat deck down to the E-deck, and also acted as a gateway for many second class public spaces. There was also a lesser known second class stairwell located below the main mast. It was mostly the same, although it didn't have an elevator. Second class did have a plentiful amount of public spaces though, such as a dining saloon on C-deck, a smoking room on B-deck, a library, and smaller but still comfortable and luxurious cabins. Second class had promenade spaces on the aft part of the boat deck and B-deck. As for third class, while it wasn't anything to brag about, the interiors were still comfortable and, unlike many ships of her time, had individual cabins. Third class public spaces consisted of a dining saloon on F-deck, a smoking room, and a large common area. There was also a long corridor, which ran almost the whole length of the ship. Scotland Road gave access to most of the crew and third-class spaces, and was also one of the most important parts of the ship. As for promenade spaces, third class had the entirety of the poop deck, which was quite a unique sight. During Olympic's maiden voyage, she would make a stop in Cherbourg, France, then in Queenstown, Ireland, until finally departing for the open ocean, averaging a normal 21.7 knots. On the 21st of June, she arrived in New York, 1 week after her first departure from Southampton. The ship drew much fanfare, as she was the new largest ship in the world, and people flocked to see her. She then docked in the New York harbor, where passengers would disembark. For the next few months, Olympic would continue with a line of successful voyages across the Atlantic with great popularity. That was until September 20th, 1911, 4 months after her maiden voyage. It was her 5th voyage, and she had just departed Southampton. As she was sailing away though, she came up right alongside the British cruiser HMS Hawke. The Hawke, under the command of William Blunt, was running east of the Solent, while Olympic had been running south. Olympic then began a complicated S-turn, which ended in the two ships running practically parallel to each other. With a combination of Olympic's water displacement, as well as the fact that she had begun a starboard turn, the Hawke's bow unexpectedly began to be drawn into Olympic. The captain ordered the ship hard to port, but in the confusion of tiller commands which dictated a turn to starboard, the ship turned the wrong direction. The Hawke smashed into Olympic's starboard stern, creating a hole above the waterline as well as one below the waterline, breaking the propeller shaft. This allowed water to flood two of the ship's watertight bulkheads, although luckily, the watertight doors prevented the ship from sinking. Olympic then turned around and limped back to Southampton. As for Hawke, the crew worked tiresomely to pump out the water. The ship nearly capsized, although managed to make it back to port. Now, Olympic had been designed with 16 watertight compartments, 2 of which had been flooded. If the ship had been hit on the bow, up to 4 compartments could be flooded and the ship would still be okay. Although, Olympic had only been designed with this much flooding to take place on the bow. That level of strength did not show for the amidships and stern. In that case, only up to 2 watertight compartments could be flooded. Olympic was very lucky, and as she anchored off Southampton dock, she would be very hastily patched over the course of 2 weeks, then would sail to Belfast for more permanent repairs. These repairs would last until November of 1911, which inevitably delayed Titanic's completion, as Titanic's propeller shaft would be removed and installed on Olympic. Nevertheless, Olympic would be finally put back into service on November 20th, 1911, and would continue 4 months of uneventful crossings. That was until February 24th, 1912, when she would once again be pulled from service after she threw a propeller blade on her eastbound crossing to New York. She would be forced in repairs at Belfast for 8 days, where Harland and Wolff Builders stripped another part from Titanic, which delayed her crossing by 3 weeks. Yet again though, Olympic would be back in service on the transatlantic route, with Titanic's main voyage set for April 10th, 1912. After this series of setbacks, White Star Line could not afford any more mistakes. The future was looking bright, as not only would Titanic soon be in service with Olympic, but a new ship of the class, Britannic, had just been laid down. What could possibly go wrong? In the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912, Olympic, under the command of Captain Herbert Haddock, was steaming away from New York en route to Southampton. All of a sudden, though, wireless operator Ernest James Moore received an unnormal message through his Marconi set at 12:15 a.m. CQD, come quick, danger, this is Titanic. 500 miles away, Olympic had just received a distress call from her brand new sister. Sending a message to Titanic about half an hour later, she would get no response. Although James Moore didn't get any response from Titanic directly, he could still listen in on all the messages being sent from other ships closer to Titanic, until eventually he could get a good idea what was happening. Meanwhile on Titanic, wireless operator Jack Phillips received a message from the Carpathia. Don't you hear Olympic calling out to you? In fact, he couldn't, as Titanic's funnels had been venting out steam, which made it almost impossible to hear the faint messages from Olympic. You see, the way Marconi systems worked in the 1910s was mostly based off of distance. There was no separate channels. If you were close enough, you could pick up the messages from anything in the area. So, while Titanic could hear all the messages coming from the several ships all around her at once, it was much more difficult to make out what Olympic was saying if you weren't paying attention. After the messages sent from Carpathia, though, Jack Phillips was prepared, and when Olympic sent the message, "Who has struck an iceberg?" he would reply, "We have struck an iceberg and need assistance." Olympic then began sailing towards Titanic, making preparations to assist. As James Moore attempted to gain more information on Titanic's condition, though, the several ships in the area trying to do the same would all be sending their messages at the exact same time, which made communication between Olympic and Titanic impossible. Eventually, he would send the message, "Olympic to all stations, stop talking, stop talking." After this, all the other ships would in fact stop transmitting, and aboard Titanic, Jack Phillips would then do everything he could to make sure Olympic knew their situation. At 1:30 a.m., James Moore would send, "Are you steaming suddenly to meet us?" And Jack Phillips froze in his seat, angered that he would even ask that. "We are putting passengers off on the boats. We are putting women off on the boats. Sinking." Olympic then understood the severity of the situation, and put full steam to the engines towards Titanic's location. Eventually, communication between the ships broke down, as Titanic's messages, even for the ships close to her, were getting weaker and weaker, until nothing. At around 2:20 a.m., Olympic asked the other ships about Titanic's condition. As the message was being sent, though, Titanic had already split in half and plunged below the surface. When Olympic was around 100 miles away from Titanic's last known location, he asked if Carpathia would like to transfer Titanic's survivors over, but Bruce Ismay, who had been aboard Titanic, said no and to continue their voyage. For the remainder of the voyage, Captain Herbert Haddock would order all music and concerts cancelled. In his eyes, this was a tragedy, and there would be no celebrations. Upon arriving in Southampton on April 21st, White Star Line would work around the clock to fill Olympic with more boats, since that was what was thought to have been one of the largest factors for the loss of life on Titanic. Since Olympic was scheduled to depart only a few days later, though, White Star Line simply couldn't fill the ship with brand new lifeboats in time, instead grabbing boats from anywhere they could find them. 40 collapsible boats would be transferred from Navy troop ships, but they were rotting and, ironically, collapsing. Many of the ship's firemen were unsatisfied, and sent a request for White Star Line to replace them with wooden lifeboats. Obviously, though, this was impossible, and instead of White Star Line canceling the voyage until the request could be fulfilled, they did nothing. Later that day, 284 firemen went on strike in protest, with White Star Line signing on 100 new workers to take their place. On April 25th, 5 of the collapsible lifeboats were tested, only one of which was shown to be unseaworthy. Now, though, the firemen refused to sail because they thought the new signed-on crew was unqualified. 54 of the men were arrested for mutiny, although they would be released without any charges, and the voyage was cancelled. Over the next few months, Olympic, following the British and American inquiries into Titanic's sinking, would be used for various tests. Her lifeboats, watertight doors, watertight bulkheads, and most notably maneuverability would be the most focused on. In one of the tests, they pretended an imaginary iceberg was right ahead, and would turn in the same way and time as was reported on Titanic to see how long it would have taken to avoid it. Following this, Olympic would continue her Atlantic crossings. On October 9, 1912, though, White Star Line would finally remove Olympic from service, sending her over to Harland & Wolff for a major refit. During this refit, many major things would be changed on Olympic, most of which in response to Titanic's sinking. First of all, the lifeboat capacity would be increased from 20 to 68 for obvious reasons. Lesser known though, below the waterline, an extra layer of steel would be added over the ship's boiler and engine rooms. That way, Olympic could hold up a lot better to, let's say, an iceberg. Additionally to this, Olympic would have an extra watertight bulkhead installed, which raised her total from 16 to 17. 5 of these bulkheads would also be raised all the way up to B deck, since on Titanic they only rose up to E and D deck, which during the sinking allowed water to spill over to the next bulkheads, which doomed the ship. These improvements meant that if Olympic encountered a similar collision as her sister, up to 6 of the watertight compartments could be flooded and the ship would still be okay. More apparent to passengers, though, would be the refit to Olympic's B deck. These included extra cabins with more private bathrooms, an added Café Parisien, which proved to be very popular on Titanic, and many minor things, which made Olympic a lot more like Titanic and even better. In March of 1913, she would be returned to service, being marketed as the new Olympic, her new safety features being focused on the most. After one of the most insane beginnings for an ocean liner, Olympic would finally have peace. That is, until August of 1914, when Britain would declare war on Imperial Germany. This somewhat complicated things for the White Star Line, as with the newfound threat of German U-boats, this would make Atlantic crossings far more risky. Because of this, Olympic, under the command of Herbert Haddock, would be painted gray, with portholes blocked out and lights turned off during the night. The ship's route would also be altered to begin in Liverpool rather than Southampton, later changing once again to Glasgow. As the months ran on, though, and the threat of German U-boats grew, Olympic would receive less and less passenger bookings until October 21, 1914, when White Star Line would withdraw her from service. She then departed New York, bound for Glasgow, where she would be docked in harbor until the war ended. During the voyage, Olympic carried only 153 passengers. 6 days into the voyage, on October 27th, off the coast of Northern Ireland, she received a distress call from the battleship HMS Audacious. The battleship had struck a mine and was taking on water quickly. When Olympic arrived on the scene, 2 other ships, HMS Liverpool and HMS Fury, were already assisting the Audacious, attempting to tow her to shallower water. A tow cable was attached by HMS Fury, however, it would snap when Audacious's steering gear failed. A second cable was then attached, but would be tangled at HMS Liverpool's propeller. A third attempt would be made, but this also failed. The ship began sinking rapidly, and a decision was made to evacuate what was left of the crew to Olympic and Liverpool. At 8:55 p.m., there was an explosion on board the Audacious, and she sank minutes later. The British Navy did not want the news of Audacious's sinking getting out of the fear of the impact it would have on troops as well as the public. Because of this, passengers aboard Olympic were not allowed to leave the ship, and Olympic would be held in custody near the sinking site until the British Admiralty could decide what to do. Finally, on November 2nd, Olympic was allowed to sail to Belfast, where the passengers would disembark. She would remain in Belfast dock for the following months, until May of 1915, when the need for large troop ships would become critical. The Admiralty were reluctant at first to use large ships like Olympic for troop and hospital ship duties, as Lusitania's sinking only weeks ago had proved how vulnerable they really were. Nevertheless, though, Olympic, along with Mauretania and the newly complete Aquitania, would be requisitioned as troop transports, with Olympic's sister ship Titanic being requisitioned as a hospital ship in December of 1915. The ship would need to go through quite a lot of changes to increase her maximum capacity. Most of her furniture and fittings would be removed, and hammocks would be hung anywhere there was room. This increased her maximum capacity from around 2,500 all the way up to 6,000. She would also be mounted with 12-pounders and 4.7-inch guns on the bow and stern to protect her from U-boats. Finally, command would be passed to Captain Bertram Hayes. On September 24, 1915, HMT Olympic departed Liverpool bound for Mudros, Greece, carrying 6,000 troops. On October 1st, Olympic had just passed Cape Matapana when lifeboats from the French ship Provincia were spotted. Olympic sailed into U-boat-infested waters to help the crew of the sunken ship, which had itself been sunk by a U-boat. Upon rescuing the 34 crew members, she continued to Mudros. When the Admiralty learned of this, they were furious that Captain Hayes had put their ship at risk by stopping, as Olympic's speed was their best defense against a German U-boat. The French Admiralty, on the other hand, awarded him a Medal of Honor for his actions. Olympic would continue her Mediterranean voyages until early 1916, when the Gallipoli campaign was abandoned and all that were needed were hospital ships. Because of this, talk about sending Olympic to India was discussed, although in the end, it was decided to use her to transport troops from Canada to Britain. From 1916 to 1917, she would continue to transport troops from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Britain. In April of 1917, Olympic would be overhauled with the addition of 6 6-inch guns as well as more tools to deal with U-boats. In October of 1917, she would receive her first Dazzle camouflage, which acted to confuse U-boat commanders of the size, speed, and direction the ship was going. This version was short-lived though, as only a few months later in December of 1917, she would be repainted with a new Dazzle known as Type 19AX. It was also during this time that the USA had declared war on Germany, and so Olympic would arrive in New York on Christmas Day 1917 and would begin transporting American troops to Britain. In the early hours of May 12, 1918, under the command of Captain Hayes, Olympic was a day out of Southampton when her lookout spotted the surface U-103 attempting to fire its torpedoes at the liner. Olympic opened fire on the submarine, with Captain Hayes swinging the helm to ram. The U-boat attempted to submerge, but it was too late. Olympic smashed into the stern of the submarine, which crippled it enough for the crew to scuttle. Olympic did not stop for the survivors, but an American destroyer managed to pick up 31 survivors. The German U-boat captain denied that he had been rammed, instead suggesting that he was drawn into Olympic's enormous propellers. Upon dry docking, though, the ship's prow was found to have been bent over to port. For the remainder of the war, nothing major happened to Olympic, and in November of 1918, what had been the most bloody conflict to date ended. Olympic would not return to passenger service quite yet, though, as there were still hundreds of thousands of troops who need to be brought back home. Instead, the ship would be hastily painted with her peacetime paint scheme, and would spend the following months repatriating Canadian troops back home. This would give her the nickname Old Reliable by the port of Halifax, and in July of 1919, she completed her final voyage in this role. In her time as a troop ship, Olympic carried up to 201,000 troops, had burned 347,000 tons of coal, and had traveled around 184,000 miles. Her sister Britannic had not survived the war though, as in November of 1916, she struck a mine off the coast of the island of Kea and sank in less than an hour. Olympic, now the only ship left in her class, sailed to Belfast in August of 1919 for a complete overhaul. During this period, her interiors would be modernized and reinstalled, and most importantly, her boilers would be converted from coal burning to oil firing. This would not only reduce the need crew members operating the engine room, but it would also make her voyages a lot more efficient. After every voyage, she would need to be refueled, which took days of hard and dirty labor. Refueling Olympic now, though, would only take hours, which increased the amount of voyages she could make. During dry docking, a large dent with a crack in the middle was discovered below the waterline. It was concluded to have been a mark of a faulty torpedo fired from a U-boat. Historians today believe it was made by U-53 on September 4, 1918, while Olympic was operating in the English Channel. This has not been confirmed, though. Nevertheless, Olympic came out of the refit an ocean liner once more, with an increased gross tonnage of 46,439. She would make her first passenger voyage since 1914 on June 25, 1920. The new Olympic proved to be very popular with the public, carrying more than 2,200 passengers in one voyage in 1920. In 1921, she continued the success, carrying a record-breaking 38,000 passengers in the total year. White Star Line were still unhappy though, as they thought the Olympic was being held back without her two running mates to sail on the transatlantic route. With Germany's war reparations though, White Star Line was given two German liners, the SS Columbus and SS Bismarck. White Star Line would then convert them to the RMS Homeric and the RMS Majestic, and put them on the transatlantic route with Olympic. Finally, White Star Line had their trio, and the Roaring Twenties would prove to be the best period for the company. This was a time of innovation, where new technology was coming out at a rapid pace. The music was changing, the economy was booming, and more immigrants were wanting to come to America. Olympic remained extremely popular and fashionable, attracting the rich and famous. Mary Curie, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Prince Edward, and Prince of Wales were just some of the ship's famous passengers. One of the reasons Olympic remained so popular was the simple fact that she was Titanic's sister. Everyone wanted to sail on her so they could get a taste of what it was like for Titanic's passengers. 1924, though, would see a change in Olympic's career. Changes in the United States immigration laws would heavily restrict the amount of immigrants that could pass into American soil. Because of this, White Star Line, as well as other shipping lines, would have to resort to the tourist trade to remain relevant. On March 22, 1924, Olympic was backing out from the New York harbor when the small liner Fort St. George collided with Olympic's stern. The Fort St. George herself sustained extensive damage, although Olympic seemed to have been a little affected. Upon dry docking, though, it was found that the ship's entire stern post had been fractured and needed to be completely replaced. This involved extensive rebuilding. Following this, the order for White Star Line to cater to not only immigrants but also tourists, Olympic as well as other ships in the fleet would have their class systems restructured. Before, there was a simple but effective first, second, and third class, which had varying accommodations. It was decided, though, to add a new class called Tourist Third, which catered to tourists who wanted at least a little bit of luxury at a low cost. New cabins would be constructed for the class, however, it proved to be very popular, and White Star ended up merging Tourist Third with Second Class in late 1931, creating a class simply known as Tourist. This would somewhat fix Olympic's passenger numbers, as she began getting back to the place she was in during the early 1920s. On October 24, 1929, after years of booming economy, the stock market suddenly crashed, signaling the beginning of the Great Depression. Unemployment was high as jobs were being lost and the United States government was nearly bankrupt. Likewise, Olympic had already been losing popularity, as newer French and German liners were taking the world by storm with their artsy interiors and streamlined exteriors. This resulted in an average of 500 passengers on Olympic per voyage, which was less than half of what she had previously carried. In early 1932, Olympic's running mate, Homeric, was withdrawn from service, which left Olympic and Majestic as the only two White Star liners on the Southampton to New York route. Olympic would then be brought into dry dock in late 1932 for a modernization that would hopefully save the ship. During this period of 4 months, more private bathrooms were added in first class, a dance floor was added in the dining saloon, and more suites were added forward of the B deck. Many of her interiors would also be switched around and adjusted during this time, such as the grand staircase, which was painted green for some reason. Upon re-entering service in March of 1933, her maximum capacity was 618 first class, 447 tourist class, and only 382 third class. Despite this refit/modernization, in the entire year of 1933, Olympic only carried 9,000 passengers in total, the first recorded net loss for the ship. In the morning of May 15, 1934, Olympic had been hit with heavy fog. Because of this, she was being guided into New York by the Nantucket lightship LV-117. Under the command of John Binks, Olympic had been heading at a steady speed towards the lightship's radio signal, but had not steered away because of the fog obscuring their view. By the time the ship's crew had noticed the mistake, it was already too late, and soon after, the lightship appeared from the fog directly in front of Olympic. Captain Binks oared full astern, but she was already too close and smashed into the lightship bow on. It sank in 30 seconds. Somehow, 7 of the crew were able to escape in time out of the 11, although 3 of whom would die shortly after of their injuries. Upon arriving in New York, Olympics captain would shed sorrow for his mistake, although mentioned how fast his crew reacted, lowering the boats to rescue the surviving crewmen. After this event, the future was not looking bright for Olympic. With both Cunard and White Star in bad shape, they went to the British government asking for money to fund newer, more modern ships. They agreed to help, although under one condition. In the same month Olympic's collision with the Nantucket lightship had taken place, White Star and Cunard Line would merge to create Cunard White Star. Because Cunard was in far better state than White Star, they would get 62% of the company, while White Star would only get 38%. With the construction of the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, Cunard White Star simply had no need for the many inferior vessels of the combined fleet, and would slowly phase more and more ships out throughout 1934. Olympic finally got her turn on the 5th of April 1935, departing New York for the last time and being laid up in Southampton alongside her rival Mauretania. She would stay like this for 5 months, just until Cunard White Star could decide what to do with the ship. It was briefly talked about to convert her to a cruise ship for summer cruises, but this plan never went through. There's also the plan to turn her into a floating hotel, although this as well never made it past the drawing board. In the end, one of the most iconic ocean liners, as well as Titanic's sister ship, was sold for scrap in October of 1935, being towed to the city of Jarrow on October 11th. While this was sad, for the 100,000 workers who had been suffering from the Great Depression, the ship's arrival was somewhat of a savior for them. Olympic arrived in Jarrow 2 days after she had departed Southampton for the last time. The scrapping then began after her fittings were auctioned off, and between 1935 and 1937, Olympic's superstructure was demolished. Then, upon towing to Inverkeithing, the final demolition would take place, which was finished by late 1937. Olympic in total completed 237 round trips across the Atlantic, carrying 430,000 passengers and traveling 1.8 million miles. Even today, over 80 years since Olympic scrapping, you can still find much from her fittings and furnishings all over the world. The fittings from Olympic's first-class lounge and aft grand staircase are now installed in the White Swan Hotel in England. Much of her furniture, light fixtures, windows, and flooring are also in an art museum in Northumberland. Likewise, in 2000, Celebrity Cruises purchased much of Olympic's wood paneling to create the RMS Olympic restaurant for their cruise ship Millennium. A lot of people seem to believe that Olympic was only famous because she was Titanic's sister, but I strongly disagree. In the end, we remember Olympic as the ocean liner that could never catch a break, a beginning which saw several catastrophic events, a long service in World War I which made her a legend, a post-war career which saw many ups and downs, and a sad but necessary end, caused by a decline in popularity as well as the Great Depression that was completely out of their control. These reasons are why we look back at Olympic as such an iconic ship. Not because of where she came from, but because of what she became known as. Old, reliable.